Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to go over some problem sets or exercises as a companion to while loops. I have a bunch of exercises ready in Visual Studio Code, so let's get right into it. Okay, so these videos are meant just for a little bit of extra practice if you would like kind of to play around with while loops. I've noticed that this is a tricky concept as you first get started, so definitely give these a shot as you're going through this series for learning JavaScript if you feel that you need more practice. So let's start with a warm-up. This warm-up exercise right here is asking us to print out the numbers from 5 to 10 inclusive using a while loop. So go ahead and try that real quick and then we'll try it out together. Okay, so in order to do this, we need to create a variable that's going to be a number that starts at, it looks like 5. Eventually this variable is going to keep increasing and it's going to go all the way up to 10. So I'm going to create a let variable instead of a const here because I know that I'm going to keep changing it or manipulating this variable. So I'm going to say let, let's just say loop number equal to 5. I'll use some camel case here for my variable names, and I'll say while the loop number is less than or equal to 10. So there's a couple ways you could have done this. You could have also just done less than 11 or less than or equal to 10. Really a personal preference thing, depends how you like to read things and what makes more sense to you. It doesn't really matter too much. But what matters here is inside the loop. So we want to print out the number 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10. So that's going to be the loop number variable. So if I log out loop number, we'll see that we'll get that number printed out. So let's see what happens if I just start to run this code right here. So I'll open up my terminal, make sure I'm in the right folder, use node, run problem set warmup, and oh, I just get a bunch of 5s printed to the screen. Looks like an infinite loop. If you do get that, make sure to Control C to get out of that infinite loop so that your terminal doesn't crash. So what happened here? It looks like we're printing 5 out repeatedly, right? So this is just going to keep going on forever. And the culprit there usually is that the check, in this case, is not actually being met eventually. That allows us to exit this loop. So in this case, it's always 5. It's never ever going to be 11 or greater. So it's just going to keep looping, looping, looping forever. And that's because in this case, I forgot to actually increase the loop number variable by 1 every single loop. So if I do that, if I say loop plus plus, you could also say loop plus equals 1 or loop number equals loop number plus 1, whichever is easiest for you. I'll go with the plus plus since it's the shortest. I'll clear out this terminal, try to run this again, and we'll see that I get the numbers from 5 to 10 inclusive printed out. Great, let's move on to problem set 1. So for this one, we have a bunch of instructions. Let's go through them one at a time together. First, we want to create a variable called logged in that starts off as the Boolean value false. Then we want to create a while loop that loops while logged in is false. Then each loop, we want to print out that we have incorrect login credentials, like as a string. But after 3 loops, we want to change logged in to be true so that this loop stops. And at the end of this program, not at the end of the loop per se, because we want this to only happen one time, we want to print out successfully logged in as a string. So let's see kind of how we could go about this. I'll give you a chance to try it out first. This is definitely tricky, so give it a shot and then come back here when you're ready. All right, so again, same as the last one, we have a logged in variable. It looks like we're changing it somewhere in this program. So I'm just gonna create it as a let variable instead of a const so that I can change it. So I'll say let logged in equal to false to start. So that's step number 1. Then it's asking me, step 2, create a while loop that loops while logged in is false. So there's a couple ways you could do this. You could say while, and I'll just kind of finish off this loop so we can kind of focus on the most critical part, which is the condition. So you could say this, probably the easiest thing to do is while logged in is equal to false, okay? Another way to go about this is to use the not operator, and that reads a little bit better. And that's to use the bang symbol, which we learned in the previous video on, or one of the previous videos, I should say, on Boolean operators. So in this case, if I do bang, logged in, that's basically saying while not logged in. So it's going to take this value here, it's going to flip it as a Boolean value and then check that value. So this is false to start, which means that not false is equal to true, and we enter the loop. This definitely takes some time to kind of wrap your mind around, but the nice thing about this method, if you kind of start getting used to it, is that we can kind of read this a bit better once you get the hang of reading these loops. So it reads much nicer. We can kind of just read while you're not logged in, do these things. Okay, so now that we have this setup complete, let's look at the third instruction, which is after 3 loop iterations, we want to change logged in to be true. So how do we go about doing that? There's a few ways to do this. I'm going to go through probably the easiest way. I encourage you to post your other solutions, as there's really almost an infinite number of solutions to this that you could probably come up with. I'll just go with I believe to be the most obvious, and I'd love to see your solutions in the comments. So after 3 iterations, we're changing it to be true. So how do we kind of keep track of how many iterations we're going through? Right? Because in this case, we only have a Boolean value so far in our code, this logged in value, and we're trying to see if we're doing something some number of times, right? So kind of intuitively, I want like some kind of counter to keep track of what is happening with every single loop, and maybe it goes up by 1 every single loop to keep track of how many loops we've gone through. So I can say something like let loop counter start at, for example, 0. Okay. And maybe every single loop, what we'll do is we'll eventually increase this by 1. So it really kind of gets tricky to figure out where to do this. And there's a lot of bugs that you can occur where you maybe run this one time then more than needed. So you have to move some code around, but let's kind of just take it by ear and see how we do. So we'll say if the loop counter is exactly equal to 3. Okay, then what we want to do is we want to change logged in to be true. Okay, so we'll say logged in equals true. So we're going to reassign it to be the Boolean value true. Okay, after we've done that, what we want to make sure to do is increase this loop counter. So every single iteration of this loop, we make the loop counter go up by 1. Okay, so let's kind of see if this makes sense. So when we come in here, not logged in, that's going to be true. Is loop counter 3? No, it's 0. We're going to increase it to 1. Okay, not logged in, still true. Is loop counter 3? No, it's 1. Then we increase it to 2. Okay, great. Then not logged in, that's true. Is loop counter 3? What did I just say? 2. We increase it to 3 here because it's not 3 yet, and then we come through one more time. And finally, now it is equal to 3. So after 3 loops, we're going to get it at 3, and we're going to change logged in to be true. So we're going to enter this if statement after 3 loops have passed. We're still going to increase loop counter, so it'll be 4. But this check right here on the next iteration of this loop, where we check logged in every single time, we've changed logged in now to be true after 3 loops. So this is going to be not true, which is false. And then that's going to break us out of this loop right here, and we're going to end up in this space down here. Okay, this is after the loop. So after the loop, it's saying that we should print out successfully logged in. So I'm going to print that out. Oh my gosh, I added an extra set of quotes there. Let me try to run this, make sure I run the correct file. This is problem set 1. And it looks like it worked, right? Maybe. We're not really sure. At least it wasn't an infinite loop, right? So to really make sure that this works, what we can probably do is log out the loop counter every single time. So if I console log the loop counter, just to really confirm that we're only doing this 3 times, and I run this again, we're actually not doing it 3 times. We're doing it 4 times in this case. So my check is actually wrong. In this case, I want to check if it's equal to 2, which is what I was mentioning earlier. I always manage to mess this up and get off by 1. Fun computer errors for everybody all the time. pretty common one, right? So since we're starting at 0, we want to check to see if loop counter is equal to 2. So now if I run this, we should get 3 loops, 1, 2, 3 loops, because we're starting at 0, and then we're successfully logged in. Okay, perfect. So that was definitely a tricky one. If you didn't get that one right away, you need some help by looking at the video, don't worry. The main thing is that you're practicing this and trying to think about the logic. As I mentioned, there's many other ways to actually get this one done. So if you found another way, I'd love to see in the comments. It's definitely very creative kind of solutions you can come up with different Boolean checks and different types of variables to actually come up with a very similar solution. Let's go to the second exercise. So for this one, we want to create a while loop that will print out all of the even numbers between 10 and 40. Let's just say inclusive, for example, just to keep it easy here. And then we want to do the same thing for all of the odd numbers as well to make sure that we can distinguish between even and odd numbers using some mathematical operators. So give that a go and then we'll try it out together. Okay, so to print out numbers, we're going to need some number to keep track of. So let's say let our number equal to 10 to start, because we want to start at 10 and we want to go all the way to 40. So let's just say inclusive. Then we want to loop some number of times. So let's think about what this will be. We want to loop from 10 to 40 inclusive. So we can probably ask, as long as number is less than or equal to 40, then we can keep looping. That might seem to make sense. So we'll say while the number is less than or equal to 40. I made sure to do equal so that I can actually inclusively do 40 as well. Now the tricky part here is print out all the even numbers. So in a previous video, we saw how to do this using the modulus operator, but if you haven't seen that before, this is how we can detect even numbers in most programming languages. We can do an if statement, a conditional check, and we can ask the computer, is the number that we're looking at right now modulus with 2, right? So is the remainder of this number when divided by 2 exactly equal to 0? And if it is, then it's an even number. If it's equal to 1, which is the only other possibility, then it's an odd number. All right, definitely get used to that. Try to think of how that will work. If you're confused by this, definitely refer to the mathematical operators video to see how this actually works behind the scenes. So if we're in the even case, so this is the even number, then we want to console.log the number. And technically, I think that's it, right? Because if we don't enter this loop, or sorry, if we don't enter this conditional statement, then we kind of just move to the next loop right away, right? We don't actually print out anything out here. We're not printing out anything out here. So we're not actually going to get any printouts except in the case of an even number, which is what we're checking with this conditional value. So let's clear this screen and let me try to run this problem set 2. Oh, and I get an infinite loop. All right, so what happened there? I'm glad that that happened. You can see that everyone makes these mistakes all the time. Hopefully you caught it as I was coding this. I forgot to increase the number every single loop. So one interesting question here before I actually write the answer is, where does this happen, right? I want you to think about that. Does it happen in here inside the conditional statement, or does it happen outside of the conditional statement on every loop iteration? Okay, so once you give that a thought, the answer for that is that every single loop, we want to increase number by 1. If we were to only try to increase number by 1 inside of this conditional statement, then we would still end up in an infinite loop, because eventually what would happen is we would come in here, we would increase number to 11, and then we would just loop forever, because we would never enter this case again, because 11 is an odd number. So let's see what happens now. Hopefully this is actually the correct answer. And there we go. That's the correct answer. And just to show you what would happen if I did move this up here, as I mentioned earlier, if I tried to do that really quick and I run this again, I would get an infinite loop. So in this case, you can see that we're not actually printing anything out because it's actually running code over here repeatedly, this code, which is nothing, and it just keeps running forever, even though nothing is printed out. So if you do see this, it's probably also an infinite loop. So Control C to get out of that. Okay, Let's go to the final problem set. So I've saved the best one here for last. This is definitely the most challenging one. So let's kind of go through this together, and I'll kind of lay the groundwork for it and give you a chance to actually give it a shot. So for this one, we want to create a while loop that runs from the numbers 1 to 100. Okay, seems pretty easy. Then we want to do something every 10 loops. We want to print out checkpoint and then the loop number. All right, that seems not too bad. On loop 50, we want to only print out the message halfway there. Interesting. Okay. And then on the final loop, 100, we want to print out only you made it. Okay, also quite interesting. So I'm guessing we're going exactly up to 100 in this case and starting at 1. So we're going to get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, but at 50 only want halfway there, and all done. So I've printed out what we want the output to be. So I think I skipped step 5, which is after the loop we print out all done. But we want this output to be like this, right? When we run this program, we want to see checkpoints 10 through 40. Then halfway there, then 60 through 90, then you made it, and all done. And the halfway there would be for loop 50, and the you made it being for loop 100, and the all done just happening all the time afterwards. Okay, definitely a tricky one. There's many ways to go about this. Many of them lead down kind of the path of a few bugs here and there where you might get the wrong things printed out, but definitely take as many stabs at this as you can, or as your gut will muster. And if you do get stuck, definitely refer back to this video where we'll look at the solution together. Okay, I'll give you a chance to try that out, and I'll see you in a sec. So when you're back, let's kind of go through this step by step. So the first step, a loop that runs from 1 to 100. So let's assume that this is inclusive. So let's just say, let's just go with count this time as our number, equal to 1. So it starts at 1. Then we want to loop from 1 to 100. So this is just pretty simple sounding. I'll create the structure. So what do we want the condition to be? Well, we're starting at 1. We want to go to exactly 100. So maybe we can say while count is less than or equal to 100. You could have also done while count is less than 101, whichever makes you happy, as long as you get the same answer. So that's kind of step 1 done. All right, we got a little ways to go. Every 10 loops, we want to print out checkpoint and then the loop number. Okay, so this is where things get kind of funky and interesting. So one thing you might have thought of is like, okay, well, we're only going 10, 20, 30, 40, and then we have 50 here. Maybe I can do this. Maybe we can say, while count is, or if count, is equal to 10, then, do something here. And then if it's equal to 20, then checkpoint 20. And if it's equal to 30, etc., equal to 50 halfway there. You could do that. I would like you to attempt not to do that, however, because eventually you can imagine a loop that asks you to maybe do this 100 or 1,000 times, or maybe 10,000 times, right? So we want a way to automate these repetitive ones, because these don't seem to change, right? The only unique ones that we have are these halfway there's for now, and then the 100 case. Okay, so let's see if we can automate these cases. So how would we do that? If you look carefully, you can see that these are all 10, 20, 30, 40, 60, 70, 80, 90. These are all evenly divisible by 10. Okay, so another way to think about that is that the remainder of each of these numbers, when divided by 10, is actually 0. Okay, so very similar to how we checked for even numbers. So we can actually say this: if the count divided by 10 and the remainder, so the modulus operator, is equal to 0, this means that the number is evenly divisible by 10, right? So let's see what happens. If we log out the number, let's see what we get. I'm going to make sure to actually increase my count by 1 here so I don't make the same mistake as in the previous exercise, so we don't have an infinite loop. So we should see the numbers from 1 to 100, but every 10 we'll get this printout. So I'm just going to run node and then problem set 3. And you can see that we do get 10 to 100. So that works out really well. Okay, But the problem with this is that we have 50 and we have 100 printed out. And this is where things get a little bit tricky. So if you notice, I had a hint on here. We didn't go through this in the previous videos, as there are a few cases where you would need this, but the break keyword is more common. This is similar to break, but kind of a little bit different. So if you had a chance to look at continue, I encourage you to try that keyword out. It makes this a little bit easier, I guess. However, there are ways that we can do this without the continue keyword as well. So the continue keyword allows us to effectively break without really breaking. So that means that we can actually tell the loop to immediately skip to the next iteration right away. So we don't actually execute any code below the continue keyword. We just go right away to the next iteration of the loop. Okay, so how does that help us? Let's think about this. We want it so that if we're at the number 50, that we print out a special message and then we immediately go to 51 so that we don't get this printed out. So let me show you what I mean. If I look above this, and it does matter where we kind of put these to some extent with the order of the printouts, but if I say count, and then I say mod 50 equals 0, this would work for checking to see if a number is 50, but the problem with this is that it would also work if we have 100, because 50 divided by 100 is 2 exactly, and we get a remainder of 2. So we can't really automate it like this because we need a different message for when count is 100 than when it's 50. So we're actually just going to exactly check if it's 50. So we're going to say if count is equal to 50 exactly, then we want to print out this halfway there message, right? So I'll say console.log and I'll say halfway there, just like that. Okay. However, we still want to increase our count, right? So maybe we could put count plus plus here, and then we can say continue right here. I'm going to fix this in a second because this might seem kind of redundant, but what we're saying is if count is 50, then I want to print out halfway there. We want to make sure to increase the count so that it doesn't remain at 50, and then we want to continue. So what does continue mean? Continue means that we skip all of the rest of this code. We don't run this if statement, and we don't run count plus plus. So let me comment out these 2 lines of code right here, just so that we can see what happens if we don't have that in there. If I run this, you'll see that we get 10, 20, 30, 40, and we get halfway there. So it looks like it's working, but then we also get 50, right? And that's because in the 50 case, we enter this loop because 50 is exactly equal to 50, but we also enter this loop, or sorry, conditional statement. So we enter this conditional and we enter this conditional because 50 mod 10 is also 0. Okay, so we want a way to tell JavaScript, hey, I want you to run this one, but then when you're done running this one, I want you to like skip the rest of this loop and just kind of go to the 51 and don't bother looking at any of this code. And that's what the continue keyword does. However, if we just had continue, just like this, and I run this, you'll see that I get an infinite loop. And let me stop that with Control C. And that is because it's forever going to be stuck at 50. So we're going to say is count 50, we're going to log halfway there, and we're going to continue. And we never actually increase count. Okay, so we want to make sure that we increase count by 1 so that we don't end up in this infinite loop situation. Definitely is going to take some practice to run through this logic. As I mentioned, it's a bit of a complicated problem on purpose so we can learn these concepts together. Okay. Also, I'd like you to think about what happens if we were to put this below this if statement and how that would change things. But to finish this off, what we'll do is we'll also say if count is exactly equal to 100, then we kind of want to do the same thing. We want to console.log and we want to log out the you made it. So I'll just grab that and I'll put it in here. And then we want to do the same thing. We want to say count plus plus and we want to continue. Okay. So let's see if that works. And you can see that we pretty much have our solution. The only difference between our solution and this one is that we still need to log out checkpoint and the number, and then we also need to log out all done. So the all done is pretty easy, we can put that right here at the end. We can say console.log all done, just like that. The checkpoint case, however, is going to need us to learn a slightly new concept that we haven't seen yet. We can do this a couple ways, but I'd like to introduce a template string to do string interpolation so that we can use this later on to print out custom messages. So for the checkpoints, we want to print out the checkpoint and then the number of the loop. So this is the count variable. We want to print out checkpoint and then the count variable. Anytime we want to put a variable inside a string like this, we can use what's called a template string, which is actually uses backticks. So I'm going to use backticks just like this, and this is the key usually above the tab key on most keyboards in the top left of the keyboard most of the time. So it's just like the angle brackets, or angle, sorry, quotation marks. And in here we can write any string. So I'll just say checkpoint, just like that. However, I want to put this variable inside the string. I can't do this. I can't just say count, right? Because if I do this, what'll happen is I'll get this, right? I'll get literally the word count printed out, which is not what we want. We want the variable count printed out. The way that we can interpolate this variable into the string is by using these backticks for the string, then surrounding the variable in curly brackets and starting it with a $sign, just like this. So $, curly brackets, and then put in any variable and it will be turned into a string and put inside the string along with the rest of the string content. Like in this case, the checkpoint, exclamation, and the space. So that's called string templating or string interpolation. And if I clear the console and I run this, you'll see that we actually get our answer, which is fantastic, right? We get exactly what we need, which is checkpoints 10 through 40. Then we get halfway there, then checkpoints 60 through 90, you made it, and then all done. And this is made possible using the continue keyword. Okay, so I hope that this wasn't too crazy for all of you to go through with me. I know that I've said a couple of times already that this definitely requires some practice to get through, but it really is not something that you would get through right away. There are other solutions to this that require kind of a different ways of thinking. I would say that we can definitely clean this code up in many other ways, but I'm just going to stick with this because I think the explanation is probably the most logical as you're walking through it at a basic level. If you do come up with other solutions to this, please post them in the comment and we can kind of look through them as a group together. However, that's it for all of these exercise videos. What we're going to do in the next set of videos is go through the other type of loop, the main kind of loop, which is a for loop. And that allows us a different style of syntax to actually loop through items in a way that we have a bit more control over. What you probably noticed is that in a lot of these loops, we had to create kind of this counter variable or some other variable kind of to keep track of what was happening behind the scenes so that we could kind of break out of the loop at the correct time. The for loop takes that into account and allows us to actually integrate a lot of those concepts directly into the loop construct itself so that we can kind of have something a bit more concise and not forget to do things like this, like I always do, where we have a counter, for example, and then we increase the counter or do something to break out of the loop. Okay. So I'm excited to kind of get to that video next. If you enjoyed and valued this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel as well. Just leave any comments you like about what you felt about this video, the difficulty of the problem sets, and any solutions that you might have come up with that differed from mine. I'd love to read through them. That said, I'll definitely see you in the next video.